The old gray pickup truck rolled to a quiet stop along the sun-bleached road that cut through the heart of the southern town. The air shimmered with heat, rising from the asphalt in lazy waves. John Carter, an aging black veteran in his 70s with silver-flecked hair and a spine worn by decades of war and labor, pulled the door open and climbed out with a slow, practiced grace. His knees protested with every motion, but he kept moving, steady as the sunrise. The sign above the little building read, "Tom's Diner, good food, better company." It had hung in that same spot for over 50 years, its paint faded by time, but its meaning still warm in the memories of many. For John, this diner wasn't just a place to eat, it was tradition. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he came for a cup of coffee and a slice of the best apple pie in the county. For years, it had been his quiet ritual, the same stool at the counter, the same creak of the doorbell above, the same nods and smiles from people who had seen him as a fixture in their town, even if they never truly knew him. But today, something was off. As John pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of the bells overhead echoed into a silence he didn't expect. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee still lingered in the air, comforting and familiar, but the hum of conversation had died the moment he stepped in. Every head turned, every voice fell, and in that breathless hush he felt something ancient and cold wrap itself around his chest. He nodded politely, trying to dismiss the tension as some odd coincidence. Maybe someone had dropped a plate. Maybe the power had flickered. Maybe it was just in his head, soldier's instinct, he told himself. Too many years reading danger in shadows, but the silence didn't lift. He made his way to the third stool from the left, the one that had become his over the years, and sat down. Slowly, carefully. The counter felt cooler than usual beneath his fingers. Then, from the kitchen doorway, Tom Harris emerged. Tom, the owner, a man John had known for more than a decade. He wasn't a close friend, but they'd exchanged holiday greetings, shared the odd story about their fathers and childhood mischief. Tom had once said, "You're the kind of man I wish my dad had been, John." That had meant something at the time, but now Tom's eyes didn't carry recognition. His smile, once casual and welcoming, was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. His brow furrowed, his jaw clenched, and when he spoke, his voice was rough and unfamiliar. "What can I get you today, John?" John blinked, unsure for a moment whether this was a joke. "Just the usual," he said gently. "Coffee and a slice of your famous apple pie." Tom didn't move. His knuckles whitened as they gripped the edge of the counter. "We're out of pie," he said. John looked to his left, where a fresh pie sat behind the glass display, steam still fogging the inside. He smiled politely. "Looks like there's still a full one right there." Tom's voice rose sharply, slicing through the room like broken glass. "I said we're out. Matter of fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." John sat frozen. For a long second, his breath caught in his chest. He looked around the diner. Every eye was on him again, some wide with shock, others narrowed in shame or embarrassment. A few looked away. John slowly stood. "Tom, I don't understand." "Did I do something wrong?" Tom sneered. "You did plenty just by walking in here. I don't serve your kind in my place. Now get out before I call the cops." The words didn't just sting, they tore through something fragile and deep. Something that had taken decades to build. For a moment, John wasn't in 2020-something. He was back in 1963, standing outside a restaurant in Georgia with a sign in the window that said, "No coloreds allowed." But that was a long time ago, and this was Tom. John looked at him, trying to find any trace of the man he used to respect. But there was nothing left. Just hate wearing the face of someone who had once nodded across the counter and asked about his grandkids. As John turned to leave, shoulders heavy, a young woman stood up from her booth. Her voice trembled. "This isn't right. You can't treat him like this." Tom spun on her, fury darkening his face. "This is my diner, my rules. You don't like it, you can leave too." And she did. She hesitated, then lowered her eyes and sat back down. Her courage had flared for a moment, but the weight of fear pressed her back into her seat. John stepped out into the sunlight, but it no longer felt warm. He walked to his truck like a man carrying a secret no one wanted to see. When he closed the door behind him, the silence inside the vehicle felt louder than the whole world. For a long while, he didn't move. The steering wheel trembled in his hands. He had fought in wars, buried friends, held comrades as they took their last breath halfway across the world. He had watched his country struggle to keep its promise of equality, and he had waited, patiently, faithfully, for the world to become better than it was. But now he sat outside a place that once felt like home, kicked out like a stranger, shamed like a criminal. He could leave, he could drive away, pretend it didn't happen, write it off as one man's ignorance. But something inside him shifted. He straightened. His breathing steadied, and deep behind his eyes a fire lit. Because John Carter was not just a veteran. He was not just an old man with a soft smile and a quiet way of speaking. He was a father. And his son? Well, Tom Harris had just insulted the wrong man's father. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet office lined with legal briefs and campaign banners, Senator Michael Carter paused mid-sentence. His aide had just stepped in, eyes serious, voice low. "Sir, there's been an incident back home." Michael's hands stilled over a folder marked Veterans' Rights Initiative. He had been preparing for a press briefing, just another day on Capitol Hill, but something in the aide's tone made his stomach tighten. "What kind of incident?" The aide hesitated. "It's your father, sir. He was refused service. At Tom's diner, there's video and witnesses. They say it was racially motivated." For a long second, the world seemed to tilt. Michael's mouth went dry. He reached for the phone without another word. It rang 3 times before an old, familiar voice answered. "Hello, Dad." Michael's voice broke with a mixture of love and fury. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" There was a pause, then. "I'm all right, son. Just tired. It's been a long day." Michael closed his eyes. That voice, so steady, so calm. The same voice that used to read him stories when he was 6, that taught him to stand tall when the kids laughed at his skin, his speech, his name. That voice should never have had to whisper through pain. "I'm coming down," Michael said. "This ends now." By the next morning, the whispers had grown into a storm. Outside Tom's diner, protesters stood in quiet defiance. Signs read "No TO hate, respect our veterans, dignity for all." Some had come from neighboring towns. Others were locals who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen what they'd seen. Inside, Tom stood behind the counter, pretending the walls weren't closing in. He burned the eggs. He dropped a plate. He glared at every customer who dared to look at him too long. The phone rang off the hook. Reporters, local activists, even an army base chaplain demanding an explanation. But Tom clung to the belief that he'd done the right thing, that he was standing by principle. He didn't see a man he hurt, only a system he feared was slipping away. One where his father's voice still echoed in his ear, hissing about pride and bloodlines and who deserved to be served. Then the bell over the door rang. The room hushed. A man stepped in, dressed not in military green or hometown flannel, but in a tailored Navy suit. He moved like someone used to being watched, like someone used to walking into rooms where the stakes were measured in more than coffee and tips. Michael Carter, Senator of the United States, son of John Carter. Tom's heart stuttered. Michael didn't sit. He didn't smile. He simply stepped up to the counter and said, "Are you Tom Harris?" Tom nodded stiffly. Michael's eyes were calm. But beneath that calm was fury, leashed, focused. "You refused service to my father yesterday, a decorated war veteran, a man who's lived in this town longer than this diner's been standing." Tom puffed his chest. "This is my place. I serve who I choose." Michael nodded slowly. "On what grounds?" Tom faltered. "He made some people uncomfortable." Michael leaned in. His voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "What made you uncomfortable, Mr. Harris? The uniform he wore, the medals he earned, or the color of the skin that bled for this country?" Tom's lips curled. "I don't need to explain myself to you." "No," Michael said, stepping back. "But you will explain yourself to the federal investigation we're launching into your discriminatory business practices, and the civil lawsuit my office will be filing, and the Veterans Alliance protest scheduled for this weekend, and the national news story you're about to become the face of." Silence, cold and heavy. "You made a mistake," Michael said, turning toward the door, "and you picked the wrong man to humiliate." Tom's knees wobbled. He reached out for the counter to steady himself, but the edges had already started to blur. Because for the first time in his life, Tom realized that the world wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving forward, with or without him. Across town, John Carter sat quietly on his porch, watching the sunlight bend through the trees. He held a photograph of his late wife, Margaret, her smile soft, her eyes bright, her memory eternal. "I wish you could see him, Maggie," he whispered. "Our boy S a storm, and he's gonna clean this town." Michael joined him just before dusk. No cameras, no reporters, just father and son side by side. "I didn't want this," John said softly. "I didn't want it to become a war." Michael nodded. "I know, but sometimes peace only grows where injustice is uprooted." They sat in silence for a while. The air was thick with jasmine and old wounds. Then Michael said, "Dad, what if we bought the diner?" John turned. "What?" I mean it, I've already spoken to some folks. The place is struggling. Tom's in more debt than he lets on. What if we took it and turned it into something better? John raised a brow. You want to run a diner? Michael smiled faintly. No, I want to rebuild a town, one table at a time. John laughed for the first time in days. That's the most Carter thing I've ever heard. By the end of the week, Tom received an envelope under his door. Inside, a formal offer to buy the diner. It was more than fair, nearly double the market price. The only condition, he leave. Quietly, immediately, no reopening, no rival establishment, just gone. Tom stared at the letter for a long time. It smelled like finality. It tasted like shame. He wanted to tear it up. He wanted to shout. He wanted to crawl back into the time when his father's world still made sense. But that time was gone, and somewhere in his chest something cracked open, a silence that begged to be filled. Days later, the town awoke to a surprising sight. The diner, once bearing the name Tom's, now had a new sign being installed, the Veterans Table. Below it, in smaller letters, a place for every story, a seat for every soul. And standing in front of the glass, watching the workers put up the letters, was John Carter. His shoulders were still bent. His hands still trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. But in his eyes was something powerful, not revenge. Not bitterness, but purpose, because some wounds don't just need to be remembered, they need to be rewritten. The first morning the Veterans' Table opened, there was fog on the windows and light in the sky, as if the sun itself had paused to see what might happen. John Carter stood by the counter in a clean white apron, his posture upright though his bones ached from the early hour. Beside him was Rosa, a retired nurse from down the block, and a high school student named Isaiah who had lost his grandfather to the war before he was born but still showed up to serve coffee with pride. The line outside started forming at 6:30 a.m. Not just veterans, not just black families, but old couples who had seen too much, single moms with kids in tow, even a few of Tom's old regulars who had crossed the street with uncertainty in their steps and quiet shame in their eyes. No one was turned away. Everyone was greeted with the same smile John had offered for years, warm, tired, but real. The coffee was strong. The biscuits were soft. The walls had been painted a pale amber, and on one side a mural was in progress. Portraits of local veterans from every war, including women and men, black and white, uniformed and out of uniform, all linked by a golden thread that ran through the image like a lifeline. At the center was a photograph, blown up and framed, of young John Carter in Vietnam, helmet tilted back, smiling like he still believed peace was coming any day now. By noon, the diner was full. And then came the moment that tested it all. A man stepped inside, tall, weathered, eyes cautious. It was Pete Darnell, Tom Harris's cousin. For a beat, the entire room tensed. John saw him, recognized him instantly. Pete had shouted things during the protest, held a sign that read, "Don't erase us." But now he stood there empty-handed. No sign, just silence. John walked up slowly. The whole diner held its breath. Pete cleared his throat. "I heard the coffee's still good." John looked him in the eye. "It's better." Pete nodded, lips pressed. "Mind if I sit?" John motioned to a booth, plenty of room, and just like that the tension broke. A table of old white farmers, friends of Pete's, came in next. Then a church group. Then a wheelchair-bound vet who had once sworn off ever returning to that corner of town. Now he sipped coffee while John asked about his medication. There were no speeches that day, no grand declarations, just a quiet revolution made of kindness and hot meals and eyes that finally looked without looking away. Michael came back every Sunday, usually after church. Sometimes with reporters, sometimes alone. He never made it about himself. Just sat with his father, took off his jacket, poured coffee, and listened to whoever had a story to tell. And stories came. A man who had served with John in '72. A woman whose brother never made it back from Kuwait. A teenager who had been ashamed of his own name until Michael shook his hand and said, "There's power in where you come from." One afternoon, a letter arrived. It had no return address. Inside was a small photograph of the old diner sign folded in half with 4 words scribbled beneath it. "I was wrong, sorry." No signature. John read it once, then again. He didn't show it to Michael. He didn't need to. Some things didn't have to be public to be powerful. Meanwhile, the mural on the wall grew. More faces, more stories, and above them all in gold lettering, "They served, now let us serve them." News outlets began to visit. A segment aired nationally. The diner that rewrote a town. Donations poured in. Scholarships were founded. Veterans who had once disappeared into the background of their own towns were now front and center, celebrated, heard, fed. And through it all, John Carter remained steady. He didn't want praise. He didn't want revenge. He wanted healing. One morning, as he swept the steps before sunrise, he found a little boy sitting on the curb, legs swinging, eyes wide. John asked, "You okay, son?" The boy nodded. "My mom says you're a hero." John smiled, kneeling slowly until they were eye to eye. "You tell her I said heroes are the people who keep showing up, even when they're tired." The boy grinned and asked for a job. John laughed and said, "You come back in 5 years, I'll save you an apron." That day, John's knees hurt a little less. His hands didn't shake as much when he held the tray. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe it was what happened when a man finally sees that his story, after being silenced, pushed aside, denied, has become a place others can stand on, a table others can sit at. And still, despite everything, he rises to greet them with warmth. Because that's what dignity looks like. Not loud, not vengeful, but full of grace, full of steady, quiet strength, the kind that changes everything. One Saturday, Michael leaned over their usual booth and asked, "Dad, do you miss the quiet?" John took a sip of coffee, looked around at the hum of voices, the scrape of forks, the joy in the room. Then he said, "Not for a second." The following spring, a woman arrived from out of state. She wore a slate-colored coat and carried a leather satchel held too tightly, like it was the only thing anchoring her to earth. Her name was Lillian Harris, Tom's daughter. No one had seen her in years, not since she left Mornington for college, then never came back, not even when her mother passed. The town had whispered about it, about the shame she must have felt, about the divide between her and her father. But now here she was, standing outside the veterans' table, staring up at the mural as if trying to make sense of the story it told. John noticed her before anyone else. He was wiping down the counter, humming a tune only men of a certain age remembered. When their eyes met, he didn't flinch, didn't frown, just nodded. Slowly, Lillian stepped inside. The room didn't hush like it used to. The diner had changed. It didn't fear ghosts anymore. She walked up to the counter, eyes flickering across every surface, like she was trying to locate the memories she had once left behind. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cracking. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for my father, for everything." John paused, looked her over, saw the weight on her shoulders and the ache in her gaze. "You're not your father," he said gently. "You're you." She blinked back tears. "Still, I needed to come see it, to see what he tried to destroy, and what you built." John poured her a cup of coffee without a word, set it gently in front of her, and when she reached for it, her hand trembled. "I've been angry for so long," she whispered. "At him, at this place, at myself, but I heard what you did, what you made this into. I had to come." John reached into his apron and slid over a faded photo. It was her as a child, maybe 10, standing outside the old diner next to her mother, holding a red balloon. "She brought you in here once," John said. "You don't remember, but you told me you wanted to be a doctor who made pancakes for breakfast. Said you'd heal people's hearts with maple syrup." Lillian laughed through the tears. "God, I haven't thought about that in decades." "It's still in you," John said, "the part that wants to heal." They talked for hours about loss, about growing up with shadows, about how sometimes the hardest thing isn't forgiving others, but forgiving yourself for surviving them. When she left, she hugged John tightly. Outside, she turned back and said, "If there's ever a way I can help, I will." And she meant it. 2 weeks later, a new sign appeared beneath the mural: Community Medical Thursdays, free checkups, no questions. Sponsored by Lillian Harris. Life, it seemed, had a strange sense of poetry. Meanwhile, Tom Harris, alone, bitter, and long since moved to a cabin outside county lines, watched the transformation from afar. He saw the news stories, heard the town hall discussions, even received a letter from his daughter he couldn't bring himself to open. Sometimes he drove past the diner, engine idling, windows rolled up, hiding behind mirrored sunglasses like shame could be tinted. He never stepped out, never knocked, never apologized, and yet John still left one chair at the counter empty, always clean, always ready. "What if he comes back?" Isaiah once asked. John wiped the counter and shrugged. "Then we'll pour him coffee and see what he does with it." Not because Tom deserved grace, but because John believed in giving people the choice to change. Because the opposite, condemnation without mercy, was a cage too many lived in already. In time, the veterans' table became more than a diner. It became a movement. Similar places sprang up in other towns, funded by local veterans, staffed by volunteers, built on the same principle. Everyone has a story, and no one should be turned away for who they are. At the 10-year anniversary, the mayor of Mornington gave a speech on the courthouse steps, naming John Carter Day a citywide observance. Cameras flashed. A band played, flags waved, but John stood quietly at the edge of it all, hands folded, letting Michael take the podium. Michael spoke about justice, about legacy, about what it means to turn pain into purpose. "My father never asked for recognition," he said. "He just asked for decency. He asked to be seen, heard, respected. And when that was denied, he didn't burn the diner down. He rebuilt it with open hands, with open heart." That night back at the house, John and Michael sat on the porch again, older now, quieter, but still lit from within by the same fire. "You think people really change?" John asked. Michael thought for a moment. "I think people are capable of it if they want it badly enough." "You did," John said. "You changed." Michael looked at him. "So did you, Dad." They didn't say much after that, just sat there, breathing, living, whole. Across town, a kid walked into the diner with a guitar case and asked if he could play a song. Isaiah, now the manager, said, "Only if you play it loud enough to wake every ancestor we ever had." And the kid grinned, stepped onto a little stage no bigger than a front porch, and sang about a town that once forgot how to love, but remembered just in time. The last line echoed through the windows like a hymn. "We built a table, not a wall." And somewhere far away, maybe even in that cold cabin in the woods, a man named Tom Harris heard it. Maybe he turned the radio off. Maybe he turned it louder. No one knows. What matters is that the music was there, the table was waiting, and the door was still open.